With the failure of OPLAN 34 Alpha and its covert operations against North Vietnam, Washington agonized over a new strategy to achieve its goals in Southeast Asia. By August it was in place, but it was a strategy few in Washington believed in. This is the story of that strategy and how a flawed policy drove US action. This channel's mission is to challenge the Vietnam orthodoxy through reference to primary sources. Much of what you know about the Vietnam War is either incomplete or false. Please consider supporting this channel and its mission through Patreon. The link is in the description. On February 20th, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson ordered planning for pressures against North Vietnam, intended to deter the North from supporting communist violence in South Vietnam and Laos. The bombing would be performed by the South Vietnamese Air Force or by Farmgate, US pilots flying VNAF marked aircraft. However, the Joint Chiefs of Staff was not interested in half measures, and on March 2nd, the JCS told Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara that US intentions to extend the war as necessary should be made clear by overt military actions. Later that month, McNamara stated that he had been impressed with the vehemence of opinion in the JCS. In the middle of March, McNamara and Taylor conferred with Ambassador Lodge in Saigon. McNamara would later recall that it was recognized that bombing would not achieve their goals, and that it might provoke Chinese intervention, but without a better alternative, the group meeting favored such action. On his return to Washington on March 16th, McNamara proposed that preparatory work should be started so the US could begin bombing if necessary. Johnson approved the report on March 17th as NSAM 288. The JCS then directed SINCPAC to create a more detailed plan. As well as action against North Vietnam, SINCPAC OPLAN 37-64 covered possible action in Laos, Cambodia and South Vietnam. More detailed planning continued after the plan was approved in April, with analysis of targets in North Vietnam and the type and scale of attack required to inflict specific amounts of damage. A list of 91 targets was submitted to McNamara on May 30th, and by August 24th the list had grown to the 94 target list. While SINCPAC was drawing up its plan, the Defense Department was drafting scenarios for the implementation of NSAM 288. As with OPLAN 37-64, small forces would make covert attacks on North Vietnam, while larger forces would be available if the North or China responded with an escalation. The JCS, however, pointed out that the larger forces were not present to counter possible escalation, but instead to achieve the goals of the plan with the use of larger overt forces, if covert action with smaller forces failed. Although both plans called for the VNAF to make preparations for airstrikes against North Vietnam, President Johnson did not inform Saigon of the plans for 4 months. A plan for the escalation of the war leaked to the press in late February or early March. The plan called for a blockade of Haiphong Harbour, raids against the coast, and the bombing of strategic targets in North Vietnam, carried out by American pilots in US or VNAF marked aircraft. Hanoi concluded that OPLAN 34 Alpha raids were designed to proceed and gain intelligence for attacks on a larger scale on North Vietnam. While their analysis was logical, it was not correct. OPLAN 34 Alpha was a plan that had failed to achieve its goals. The plan for bombing the North was a separate plan with the same objective. The Johnson administration began thinking about taking immediate action in May, prompted by the deteriorating situation in South Vietnam and the sudden gains made by the Communists in central Laos. The NSC Executive Committee discussed the situation on May 24th. McNamara stated that measures to support South Vietnam would not substitute for the use of force against North Vietnam, that the situation is still going to hell, and that we are continuing to lose. Nothing we are doing now will win. General Taylor remarked that it was too soon to conclude that the situation would fail to improve under the new Saigon government, led by Nguyen Han, and that the military would prefer to wait for autumn before taking action. On May 25th, the NSC recommended that President Johnson make the decision to attack North Vietnam at an unspecified date, if the situation in South Vietnam and Laos did not improve. On May 23rd, a team led by William Bundy, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, laid out a 30-day schedule for initiating open military action in a draft presidential memorandum. 30 days before bombing would begin, President Johnson would make a speech asking the Senate and House of Representatives to pass a joint resolution approving past actions and authorizing any future actions required to defend South Vietnam. The resolution would be passed on D-20, and on D-15, agreement would be reached with Saigon for South Vietnamese air attacks against the North, with a guarantee of protection if North Vietnam or China retaliated. On D-1, Saigon would announce that attacks were imminent, and on DD itself, the limited objective of forcing North Vietnam to end its support for the communists in the South would be stated. Congress was not to be told that immediate action against North Vietnam would follow the passing of the resolution. It was quickly realized that this would be seen as a deception, and the schedule was revised the day after it was drafted. Now the President would explain, probably in specific terms, the plan to key leaders in Congress. A preliminary draft of the resolution was prepared in May, which went into more detail as to what Congress was authorizing the President to do, without mentioning attacks on North Vietnam. The draft was revised on June 11th, making it shorter and closer to the resolution presented to Congress in August. A special national intelligence estimate of May 25th expressed the consensus of the intelligence community. It concluded that North Vietnam might respond to the proposed bombing campaign with a temporary halt to its support of communists in South Vietnam and Laos, but there was a significant danger that they would fight. Those that had drawn up scenarios for the attacks were even more pessimistic. The 30-day scenarios dated May 23rd and revised on May 24th predicted that bombing would more likely increase communist pressure in South Vietnam and Laos rather than reduce it. Later, General William Westmoreland would state that he did not favour large-scale attacks on North Vietnam. He was concerned such attacks would result in the direct involvement of the PAVN in South Vietnam, pressure which he expected would overwhelm Saigon. However, the JCS, with the exception of Maxwell Taylor, concluded that the more limited bombing proposed was inadequate and wanted a more destructive campaign, with the goal of ending support for the Viet Cong and Pathet Lao permanently. A conference in Honolulu on June 2, 1964, decided not to recommend the escalation of the draft presidential memorandum. The concern was that such action would result in escalation from the Viet Cong or intervention from North Vietnam or China in South Vietnam. General Taylor, however, argued that the US government should not reason itself into inactivity. Lodge and Westmoreland went further. The situation in South Vietnam would continue in its stalemated state unless the US could achieve a victory which would increase the confidence of the leadership in Saigon. They reasoned that a victory was the willingness to take military action against Viet Cong installations in the Laos corridor or against North Vietnam. Action would not have to lead to a reduction in the North's support for the Viet Cong for it to be regarded as a victory. In June, senior officials considered asking Congress to pass a resolution granting the President the freedom to take such action as he considered necessary, but they did not want to put such a resolution before Congress unless it could be passed quickly and without much debate. McNamara reflected the consensus at a June 10th meeting when he said, "In the event of a dramatic event in Southeast Asia, we would go promptly for a congressional resolution." The dramatic event would take place on August 2nd in the Gulf of Tonkin.